President Obama speaks out about transgender bathroom bills, how the issue divides presidential candidates. To leave the European Union or not, the president and Britain's prime minister at odds. Remembering a music superstar. How the Vatican pays tribute to Prince. And the Vatican rocks social media.
Keeping up with a 79-year-old Pope is not always easy.
The new evangelization on EWTN News Nightly for Friday, April 22nd, 2016. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lauren Ashburn. While in London today, President Obama criticizes North Carolina and Mississippi's transgender bathroom bills. The legislation prevents local governments from passing anti-discrimination rules and requires transgender people to use bathrooms assigned to their biological sex.
The laws that have been passed there are wrong and should be overturned. I think it's very important for us not to send signals that anybody is treated differently.
Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump agrees with the president, but Ted Cruz says it defies common sense. He says he doesn't want grown men to enter restrooms his daughters use. Cruz believes the bathroom bills protect privacy. The UK has issued a travel advisory to transgender people, saying citizens should be mindful of the legislation if they intend to visit Mississippi and North Carolina. We will talk more about this controversy with our political panel in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, President Obama is pushing hard for the UK to stay in the European Union, but some Brits, including Prime Minister David Cameron, thinks he should mind his own business. The two leaders met today in London to talk about a range of issues, but in a public display of disagreement, the president told the Prime Minister the U.S. would not do a trade deal with the UK anytime soon if Britain voted to leave the European Union.
Part of being friends is to be honest and to let you know what I think. And speaking honestly, the outcome of that decision is a matter of deep interest to the United States because it affects our prospects as well.
London's mayor is under attack for saying the president's Kenyan roots might have left him with a grudge against the UK. Voters will decide the EU issue in June. The President and First Lady also celebrate the Queen's 90th birthday. They met for lunch at Windsor Castle, and tonight it's dinner at Kensington Palace with Prince William, his wife Kate, and brother Prince Harry. Other stories our EWTN news team is covering in today's world. The Florida Supreme Court suspends the state's 24-hour waiting period for abortions. Governor Rick Scott signed the law last year, but the American Civil Liberties Union sued to stop it. The state Supreme Court is putting the law on hold until it decides whether or not to hear the lawsuit. Governor Terry McAuliffe signs an executive order allowing more than 200,000 convicted felons to vote and run for public office. McAuliffe, a Democrat, says it will help undo Virginia's long history of trying to suppress the black vote. And the head of the Coptic Orthodox Church in the UK calls on the world to take action to protect Christians. This on the heels of a vote in the UK Parliament to label Christian persecution genocide. Now, the bishop says the only way the violence will stop is if countries affirm the dignity of all human life. Wyatt Goolsby spoke with him this afternoon. Wyatt?
Lauren, Bishop Angelos tells me it is vital countries work together to protect all the persecuted right now, Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. He says the vote by the UK's Parliament is just the first step. The House of Commons joins the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, and the U.S. State Department in calling violence against Middle East Christians genocide. Bishop Angelos, who lobbied Parliament, says the U.S. decision impacted the UK's debate.
My point was that if this recognition is across the board, then it means that these major powers will be able to work together to represent those who are unable to represent themselves.
But the Orthodox bishop's approach is uniquely Christian.
What I'm calling for is an ability for those who are perpetrating these crimes to look at their victims as fellow human beings and inevitably what I'm going to be calling for is a forgiveness of even those who are perpetrating these crimes.
Religious freedom advocate Dr. Robert George says using the term genocide is important.
It's important for psychological reasons as well as in some ways for legal reasons. They're being killed because of their faith or their ethnic identity. That's genocide, and we need to call that by name.
For Ambassador David Saperstein, who promotes religious freedom abroad, the next step is action.
The moral consequences we had long been engaged with long before the formal designation, the need to protect populations from genocide, and so we put together the coalition of 66 countries now that intervene militarily.
Bishop Angelo says the genocide is bigger than any one particular church or any one particular nation. He says this is about looking after the humanity God created. The next step could come from the British government, who will bring up the problem to the UN Security Council. Lauren?
Wyatt, thank you very much. Countries from around the world sign a landmark climate agreement. The deal reached in Paris in December becomes official today at the United Nations. About 170 countries agreed to set targets for reducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. Pope Francis is a strong supporter of it. Little Red Corvette, 1999. You got the look. These top hits skyrocketed musician Prince to the top of the charts and hearts of the masses. Today's autopsy may not reveal the cause of death for several weeks. The sheriff says there are no obvious signs of trauma. An eccentric persona, a wildly talented artist, and a musical icon now gone. 7 Grammys, 5 #1 singles, and an Oscar made Prince one of the most successful artists of his time. But it's his music that made him so memorable. Writer, singer, producer, and performer, Prince was also an influencer, writing familiar tunes that others made famous. Racy lyrics in his own music once earned him the nickname his Royal Badness, and for his colorful fashions and hit single, they called him the Purple One. That's Prince performing in Atlanta last week, his final concert. Born and raised in Minnesota, Prince always called it home. Hardly typical for a pop star, but little about Prince was typical.
He doesn't want anyone to mourn. Knowing him, he wants everyone to celebrate him and celebrate his life.
At his estate outside Minneapolis, fans showed up to pay respect, some near tears.
And mourning like everyone else. I mean, he was so beautiful and alive, and then all of a sudden, he's gone.
The head of the Pontifical Council for Culture, Cardinal Gianfranco Ravazzi, honors the music legend in a tweet. He writes, quote, sometimes I wish that life was never ending. All good things, they say, never last. And if you haven't guessed, those are lyrics from Prince's song, Sometimes It Snows in April. It's been a month since the Vatican launched a new Instagram account for Pope Francis. Instagram says he broke a record, hitting the million follower mark in just 12 hours. Francis now has 2.3 million followers and 17 million on Twitter. Greg Burke, Deputy Director of the Vatican Press Office, joins us now. Greg, the Vatican's social media is wildly successful. How did you do it?
Well, first of all, I didn't do it. I mean, actually, this started under Benedict with Twitter, and Twitter was already a huge success with Pope Benedict, and I think actually with Francis it just became even more so. It's not the people here, it's the Pope, and it's the draw that this place is, the Vatican. I think that's to take nothing away from an absolutely commanding personality of Pope Francis, and that's added to it. But the fact is, the Vatican draws a lot of people, literally, and it draws a lot of people now on the new media as well.
So one of the things that you have been able to accomplish when you're there is to get Instagram going, and the Pope has the social media. He's very invested in these tweets. How does he approve them?
He sees each tweet, which is great, because I think there's an authenticity to that, you know, that the Pope's signing off on the tweets. These are his words. They were his words anyway. Sometimes they're just made a little shorter, or sometimes there's special occasions in which the tweets will be suggested to him. But 90% of them are his things from the homilies. Homilies especially, I might say, because that, I think, is where he is at his most relaxed and natural, although he tends to be pretty natural all the time, as you can see with people. So he signs off on them. The photos, of course, on Instagram, well, you know, the photos are the photos. That's who he is. That's what you get.
And he signs them with an F, I understand, to say that he gets the stamp of approval. You know, he's a maverick or a master communicator in many ways. How do you keep up with him?
Keeping up with a 79-year-old Pope is not always easy because there are lots of surprises. And every time people ask me, are you sure of this? And I say, well, I'm pretty sure, but with the Pope, you can never be totally sure.
Well, it sounds like your whole team is doing a great job. Thank you so much for joining us. Greg Burke, Deputy Director of the Vatican Press Office.
Thank you.
Joining me now is Gail Trotter, a Senior Fellow at Independent Women's Forum, and Melinda Henenberger. She is the Editor-in-Chief of Roll Call. Welcome to the program, ladies. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Let's talk about this transgender bathroom bill. I know we saw earlier in the program that President Obama has come out and said that the bills really shouldn't even be on the books. Gail, you've spent a lot of time talking about this issue. Tell me thoughts on it.
Well, it's interesting. Ted Cruz came out with an ad today trying to delineate his viewpoint and his position from Donald Trump on this issue.
We have that ad. We'll roll it as you continue talking. Go ahead.
And I think it's very important because skilled politicians don't like to take positions on controversial issues unless they think that they have the support of the people. So Ted Cruz in this case is taking a very strong position with this ad and delineating his position from Donald Trump because he thinks that the people are behind him. More people are behind him on this than against him.
And what it says right now, it's PC nonsense that's destroying the country. Your thoughts, Melinda?
I think it means that Trump thinks he no longer has to pitch to Republicans. Because I think Gail's right. The majority of Republicans likely agree with Ted Cruz's position on this. And I think that just says that Trump feels he's already pivoting to the general if he doesn't have to act like he really is in concert with social conservatives.
Well, speaking of pivoting to the general, it seems much more likely that we are going to have a Trump-Clinton battle coming forward since they both won New York. Gail, do you think that that's true, number one? And the question I always ask is, are we headed to a brokered convention?
Well, both Trump and Cruz would like to say that it's over in their favor. Wisconsin really switched the momentum to favor Senator Cruz. I think New York, the margin of victory that Trump was able to run up the score with, has switched the momentum back to Trump. And Trump continues to push that it's not mathematically possible for Cruz to come to the 1237 delegates needed to win on the first ballot. But Cruz is out there. He has a really strong ground game, and he's hoping that he can work the delegates on the second ballot for sure.
And Melinda, Bernie Sanders still saying he is staying in. He's going to be a nudge, I think they say, in Hillary Clinton's side.
He may well stay in. I would be surprised if he got out at this point, but I also don't see the math for his path to the nomination.
Right. Well, I hope both of you will join us at the convention in Cleveland, July 18th, and then also the convention in Philadelphia.
I'll be there.
Okay, well, you're welcome on the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Gail Trotter and Melinda Henenberger, Editor-in-Chief of Roll Call. Coming up, our one-on-one interview with the first black female Republican elected to Congress.
To me, this is not a right or left issue. This is a right and wrong issue.
What Mia Love told us about becoming a pro-life leader. And our political discussion continues, growing speculation over vice presidential picks. A milestone for Pope Francis. Today marks 43 years since Jorge Bergoglio took religious vows in the Jesuit order. He led the Jesuits in Argentina for 6 years before becoming a bishop. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Lauren Ashburn. There are 104 women in Congress. 28 of these women are Republican and only one African American, Mia Love of Utah. Representative Love is also the only freshman congressman on the select panel investigating Planned Parenthood's sale of aborted baby parts. And as the committee held its second hearing this week, Love tells Catherine Zeltner why she's fighting for the pro-life cause.
Democratic members of this committee want to see the investigation be shut down. But what do you hope this investigation does accomplish?
There are a lot of times you hear people on the other side of the aisle saying, look, we've relitigated this already. We don't have to go back. We want this shut down. But I'm glad that we live in a country where we can re-look at some of the things that we've done and reassess whether we really value human life. I mean, if you think about it, years ago, this country thought that it was okay for people to own other human beings as property. And we were able to go back and reassess and change those laws and say, hey, we have a God-given right to be here, a right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I'll do everything I can to make sure that the information that we get is out there so that people can make that moral choice. To me, this is not a right or left issue. This is a right and wrong issue.
You are the first African-American female Republican elected to Congress. What does that do for the pro-life movement?
Well, I think it's great. I think a lot of African-American females are pro-life. We're very family-oriented. The state that I come from is incredibly family-oriented. The message that we have can resonate to a lot of black families that are out there that are saying, look, we value human life. It's one of the reasons why we fight the civil rights movements. It's one of the reasons why we go out and make sure that all of us are able to live out and practice our God-given rights, our God-given freedoms.
Congressman Love, thank you.
Thank you.
John Fortier is the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Democracy Project. Wasn't that an interesting conversation about pro-life? We're going to switch gears and talk about vice presidents. How about that? You have a new report coming out, you have it right here, called Selecting a Vice President, Advice for Vice Presidential Candidates. Why do we need advice for them on selecting a vice president?
Well, partly because it isn't so simple as just waking up one morning and saying, oh, I want this person to be my vice president. It really is a process. And we had Democrats and Republicans who've worked at the highest levels of campaigns going back to 1976 coming together saying to both sides, you really have to get going now. It takes time to find candidates, to vet them, sometimes to get the candidate, the presidential candidate, to get to know the vice presidential candidates. It's not so simple as, again, putting two strangers together. So we want people to be prepared, even if it's a little bit of a different situation on the Republican side with the convention, you still have to start some part of the process now.
Well, I think that part of the interesting part of the rules process is that in 1976 you had Reagan and you had Ford, and Reagan had picked a vice president who his base did not like, and he was trying to push Ford to make that pick. How important really is it to make a good vice presidential pick?
Well, ultimately, this person has to be able to step in to be president if the worst happens to a president. So it's a very important decision. This person has to be presidential material. But also, vice presidents have become much more consequential in the White House. Dick Cheney, Joe Biden, they are advisors to their presidents. They have big portfolios, big staffs. So this is an important person, and you don't want to just pick it on political grounds.
But that hasn't been the case. We were talking the other day, you and I, about the 1800s.
Yeah, often early in our history, two candidates were thrown together, really for political purposes. They might not have even known each other. And guess what? That meant that the vice president wasn't very important during the administration. Sometimes they were left out of important decisions. Harry Truman didn't know that we were developing an atomic bomb when he became president because Franklin Roosevelt hadn't shared that with him. So there definitely are, now the vice presidents are more important, the choice is more important.
Great. Thank you very much, John Fortier, for joining us. We appreciate it. Up next, normalizing relations with Cuba, the challenges that remain. And literary giant, how people remember Shakespeare's legacy. EWTN will broadcast the one-month memorial mass for Mother Angelica. Coverage begins at noon Sunday. Marks 4 weeks since our foundress died on Easter. EWTN chaplain Joseph Wolf will celebrate the mass at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis sends a message to the Jewish people as they begin to celebrate Passover. He asks God to provide them with an abundance of blessings. The Holy Father also asks God to allow Christians and Jews to grow in friendship. And the U.S. and Cuba are starting a new relationship after 50 years of enmity, but there's concern among Cubans the U.S. could also erase a unique immigration policy that favors them. Tens of thousands of Cubans have fled since President Obama announced the normalization of relations. It's led to the highest number of people trying to make the dangerous sea crossing in the past 8 years. Ana Quintana is a Latin America policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. First of all, tell us what the law says regarding the Cubans landing in the U.S.
So our immigration policy towards Cuban migrants is largely dictated by the Cuban Adjustment Act, right, which automatically presumes that Cubans arriving here are essentially political refugees, right? That they are, and it's a fact, right? That they're escaping an oppressive government, and because of that, they're able to have expedited residency and and as well as citizenship status.
Right, and unlike Mexicans who cross in illegally and then are deported, right? So there's a way here for Cubans after 1 year to then become part of the fabric of America.
That's exactly it.
So why do you think then, isn't it ironic that people are fleeing when the president has put down the barriers? We've opened up a U.S. embassy in Cuba. Why are people still coming to the U.S.?
Well, it's kind of there's multiple reasons, but we have to largely look at this into the context of Cuba's a totalitarian country, right? It's governed by a military dictatorship, and you're seeing this refugee crisis because the Cuban government has stopped patrolling its borders, and it's allowing these Cubans it's allowing this mass exodus because this creates pressure onto the United States, and also because many Cubans are concerned that the Cuban Adjustment Act will eventually be changed because of this quote-unquote new relationship.
So they're trying to get here before that act would be changed.
Exactly, and the Cuban government is taking advantage of this fear and disinformation that's running rampant on the island, because we have to remember there is no public media on the island. It's all controlled by the state and by the Cuban government. So this is what they're hearing from the Cuban government, so they're trying to escape while they can.
What would happen if a Republican president came in? Could it push back all of these initiatives that have happened?
Well, I mean, it's going to depend on which Republican president we have, but what the next Republican president ought to do and would be best served in doing is actually putting in place conditions. If we're going to further normalize with the Cuban government, we have to put conditions in place. We have to ask the Cuban government to free political prisoners, to stop, abusing its dissidents, to stop shutting down churches. Christian Solidarity Worldwide reports a massive explosion of government repression against the Christian community on the island. And I mean, that's what the next Republican president ought to do.
Ana Quintana, thank you so much, Latin America policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Well, he wrote All the World's a Stage, but playwright William Shakespeare, who died 400 years ago this week, played out much of his life in one small English market town. Today, Stratford-upon-Avon acts as a magnet for literary lovers keen to walk in the bard's famous footsteps. On Henley Street in Stratford-upon-Avon, one house stands out among the rest. This 16th century home boasts one very famous resident, William Shakespeare. The British playwright was born in this small English village in 1564, and he died here 400 years ago.
Stratford is still quite a small market town in the middle of England. It's the home of one of the greatest writers who've ever lived, whose works are translated into all the world languages as far as we know. And it's therefore a magnet to come to understand a little bit about what made William Shakespeare Shakespeare, what formed him, to find out about the history of his time, and to celebrate his ongoing legacy.
The town receives 250,000 visitors a year. This is the church where Shakespeare was baptized, worshipped, and is buried.
When they walk into the church, the first thing they see is a beautiful medieval parish church. But once they've made their way up here into the chancel, then they can see Shakespeare's grave on the floor just in front of the high altar, and then his bust up on the wall there, which was put in by his relatives shortly after his burial.
Mark Kimmons is from Anchorage, Alaska. He says he grew up with Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, like so many children.
Initially, we were surprised that his grave is a little smaller than some of the tombs of others that we don't know the names of, but I was thinking that he was famous in his day, but not nearly as famous as he is now, so many years after his death.
During the late 1580s and early 1590s, Shakespeare left Stratford to seek fame and fortune in London. But 400 years after his death, he continues to take the town to new heights. It is a magical place to visit if you get the chance. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Good night and God bless.